Every year, like I said earlier, we read the story of Abraham and Isaac, referred to by the rabbis as the Akedah. And the rabbis teach us frequently that everything can be found in the Torah if we were just to look closely enough. And the challenge every single year, as a rabbi specifically, is as I read through the story that I have read through so many times, will I find something new? And then I always question, and then miraculously I do find something new. This year, I started to look at the actual dialogue between Abraham and Isaac. And as you can imagine, with such a short story, there's actually not that much dialogue that takes place. So just imagine the opening scene. You might want to close your eyes. God calls out to Abraham, "Abraham, take your son, your favorite son, the one you love, and offer him as a burnt offering." And so like all parents, he says, "Brilliant idea, God, I'm all for it." No, that's not at all what he says if you looked in the Bible. Sorry to burst your bubble. Abraham says nothing. He acts. He acts in agreement with God in silence. He gets up early the next morning, he saddles the donkey, prepares his servants and his beloved son. He splits the wood for the offering, taking care to prepare every single thing that he needs on the journey, because unfortunately for him, there is no Publix in the desert. And on the third day, Abraham lifts up his eyes from afar and he sees a place that God had told him about. And Abraham once again acts in silence by taking the wood and the fire, and he puts them on Isaac to carry. And Abraham takes the fire stone and the knife for himself, and the two of them, Abraham and Isaac, walk off together. Vayechu shnechem yachdav. And the only dialogue between father and son occur next. And Isaac calls out to his father and says, "Avi, my father." "Here I am, my son. We have the firestone and the wood, but where's the sheep for the sacrifice?" "God will see to the sheep, my son." And again, the two of them walk off together. Vayechu shnehem yachdav. The remainder of their walk is in fact carried on in silence. The Torah is silent too, but it simply says that they walked on for 3 days. 3 days of silence. The Bible, by the way, is not so careful in times with numbers. 3 could really mean anything. It just really means a length of time. But just imagine going with your loved one for 3 days in absolute silence. Perhaps the conversation did in fact go on, but just only in their heads. Perhaps it was a painful silence. Isaac wanting answers and wanting reassurance from his father, and Abraham too wanting the same thing, but from God. Perhaps the silence rather bespeaks something of a deep comfort that father and son had for each other. A loving, a respect, the experience that can only happen in a deep, intimate relationship where there is such an emotional connection and a spiritual oneness between two people. Silence in today's society I find to be often deeply undervalued. We as a society look at production, noise. How much have you said today? Avoiding those awkward moments of silence. Focus on GDP and making sure that our personal lives are full to the brim. Think about it. How much noise is in your life? Podcasts, TV shows, music streaming services. How much silence is there really? Mahatma Gandhi had a practice for which he was in fact famous for. Every single Monday was a day in silence. If he wanted to say something, he would write it down, or simply wait to have the conversation with you until Tuesday, or maybe Wednesday. He would never waste the day, but he would later say that, quote, "Every day I see the importance of silence. It is good for all, but for him who is deeply absorbed in his work, silence is indeed golden." For Mahatma Gandhi, he used that time to have discernment, a closeness with his own thoughts, an ability to then find strength to continue and be a leader for his people. Through his actions, he taught us that silence can, in fact, be a teacher. There is a poem, Unsaid, by Stephen Dunn, who won the Pulitzer for his poetry in 2001, entitled Unsaid. One night, they both needed different things of a similar kind. She solace, he to be consoled. So after a wine-deepened dinner, when they arrived at their house separately, in the same car, each already had been failing the other with what seemed to be an unbearable delay of what felt due. What solace meant to her was being understood. So well you give it to her before, she asked. To him, consolation was a network of agreements. Say what you will, as long as you acknowledge what I mean. In the bedroom, they undressed and dressed and got into bed. The silence was what fills a tunnel after a locomotive passes through. Days later, the one most needy finally spoke. "What's on TV tonight?" he said this time, and she answered. And they were okay again. Each forever would remember the failure to give solace, the failure to be consoled, and many, many future nights would find them turning to their respective sides of the bed, terribly awake and twisting up the covers, or, just likely, moving closer and sleeping forgetfully the night long. For this couple, silence taught them that even when they were together, they were in fact alone and apart. This is highlighted by in one of the opening verses we read, when they arrived at their house separately in the same car. Yet paradoxically, as they both move away from each other mentally and emotionally, they move toward each other physically by climbing into the shared bed. Their silence is in fact finally broken when they ask the ever-important question, "What's on TV tonight?" And then they knew they were in fact okay, yet never truly addressing one another. How true does that hold at times for each and every one of you, or has it in the past? This poem highlights the struggle we face in modernity, when silence is a good thing, as it was for Gandhi, or at times when it is something that is holding us back into our own isolation. In Justin Talbot Zorn and Lee Marks's fascinating, recently published book entitled Golden, the Power of Silence in a World of Noise, these co-authors in fact explore the significance and value of silence in today's society. They explore the modern cultural assumptions that silence is complacency. When we think about it, sometimes silence can be, in fact, a sign of violence or a protest. Just find yourself saying or think about when you heard the headline, the silence of in response was deafening. Paradoxically, they point out the real challenge to injustice as a result of noise, sometimes so forthcoming from social media that we in fact simply tune it out and become apathetic, unable to hear the details of some tragedy or economic injustice, which is in fact requiring our attention. Even more so, noise can be a sign of economic disparities. People who have the least amount of resources tend to make the most noise, whereas those who are the most able or financially or can have or do have financial stability do in fact find themselves buying luxury cars which tout silence, finding and purchasing homes far removed from civilization, and attending spas and retreats all about unplugging and tuning out. We have, in fact, almost turned silence into a commodity. Paradoxically, though, our society still struggles with silence in yet a different sphere. We find ourselves needing to break the silence when it comes to challenges such as domestic violence, sexual harassment, addiction, and mental illness. Silence can and does reinforce painful dynamics and systems which permit those difficult and challenging things that many of us face to perpetuate. But let's return to our friends Abraham and Isaac. Isaac is bound and offered as a sacrifice in silence, bespeaking of an intense trauma and an intense loss. For Isaac was losing trust with his father and maybe even his God. We learn later that the two of them, in fact, never speak one to the other. Father and son relationship forever deeply ruptured. Abraham also never speaks to God. The test now over, having learned, perhaps his faith deepened, perhaps his faith challenged forever. Sarah, a character in the story whose name we have yet to hear, the mother whose opinion was never asked and who was forced to be in silence, either by ignoring her or her chosen apathy. We learn later dies just after this incident occurs. She is never heard from again. The rabbis imagined that she learned this incident from an angel who whispered it into her ear, and she cried out 6 times, 6 piercing, without word wails, and dies. Like Sarah in the face of trauma and loss, sometimes all you can do is cry out in agony with no words available to you. When Aaron the priest, we are told, loses his 2 sons in the temple, he responds in silence. When Job lost his children, his livelihood, and even his health, he too responds in silence. Silence is what we are taught by the rabbis to offer others in the house of mourning. There simply are at times no words which can touch that level of pain. Ellen Morinus, in his book Everyday Holiness, said, quote, in the book of Job, after listening to his so-called friends trying to comfort him, Job finally erupts with, "Be silent and I will teach you wisdom." And silence is wisdom too. A wise person, therefore, is one who knows what to say and when to say it, but also knows when to keep silent. And even a fool is judged wise because he keeps silent. As we have learned, not all silences are alike. If you were to put earplugs in your ears or put yourself into a styrofoam room or sometimes maybe even swim underwater, it can be quite a different moment than standing in a silent forest or on a mountaintop, which, by the way, as someone who's hiked this past summer, silence is rare in the wild. The wind howls, leaf rustles, birds chirp, insects buzz, and creepy things sing. True silence, perhaps on a peak, has a dramatic moment and a dramatic effect on us. Today, we spend so much of our life surrounded by noise. It's quite astonishing how we, in fact, bombard ourselves with so much noise that it impacts our cardiovascular health, increases diabetes and depression. It also increases loss of sleep. Just think about how many times we fall asleep to televisions. Ethan Cross at the University of Michigan estimates that we have at times running through our heads the equivalent of 320 States of the Union addresses in our minds every single day with a number of words, most of which are at times gnarly and icky to behold. There is a story, in fact, of Florence Nightingale, which I just found fascinating, in that she categorized all of the different types of noises through her experiences in a hospital during the Crimean War and in Istanbul. She emphasized that noise is as cruel an absence of care. This can be, at times, the cruelest thing because it can be so disruptive to a patient. I bring this point to highlight yet another paradox in modernity. The idea that being alone with our thoughts can be boring. Just ask my son Daniel, who's been doing a fantastic job of sitting through that at times sitting with thoughts can in fact be boring. Yet all this stimulation is actually hurting us. In a study out of Duke Medical School, the act of listening to silence more than any auditory stimulus can in fact regenerate neurons in the brain. And so I offer you just one verse from a 15th century Indian mystic poet by the name of Kabir when he says, "Be silent in your mind, silent in your senses, and silent in your body. When all these are silent, don't do anything. In that state, truth will reveal itself to you. It will appear in front of you and ask, what do you want?" In the most Jewish sense, I remind you of the gift of Shabbat, the gift of meditation and prayer offered to us once a week. The request inside of each service for a moment of silence. Let us finally take one last journey back to Abraham and Isaac, walking in silence, just from a visual perspective of looking at the Torah itself. White parchment with black lettering. The visual image of spaces and letters the rabbis gravitate toward have meaning, that every space has meaning and every black crown on every letter equally has meaning. The whole image, the black and the white, the space and the symbol together are in fact recognized as an image of life. The noise of the letters and the space of the silence. There is a need for the existence of both. There are moments when we pray in silence, moments when we sing in silence, moments when, with our physical presence, we say, "Hineni, here I am," in silence. Moments when we ask forgiveness and offer reassurance with the touch of a hand, a reassuring nod, a simple look, all in silence. In silence, we can heal our minds, grow our bodies, and find a deeper connection to others. In silence, we can bear witness to economic disparities and discern how to address social justice issues. Silence doesn't diminish us, silence strengthens us. During the year ahead, I invite you to think about silence. Embrace what it can teach you. I pray that it is a source of comfort and healing. Empower you to feel boldly by helping you to discern when to raise your voice and when to listen. Provide a stillness before and after all the storms we face. As together we wish each other Shana Tova.